Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Hello, big ups everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture. If you are no stranger to the podcast, you know we've had quite a few conversations on the various languages of the Caribbean, be that our vibrant nation languages, Papiamento in the Dutch Caribbean, and so much more. But how many times have you considered the languages that are not directly spoken, or at least in the way that I'm communicating and sharing with you now? We communicate in various ways, whether that is through body language, like the infamous Caribbean point, the mouth point, if everybody knows what I'm talking about. If you know, you know, right? But there are several other languages, including the wealth of Caribbean sign languages, the ways that they permeate throughout the region, the differences amongst them. These are all things that we will be sharing today with you. So this is an episode I've really wanted to have, and I'm really grateful to have Kristi Ali joining me, fellow grad student. We are in the trenches together. She's in the Department of Linguistics at the University of California, Santa Barbara. So, Kristi, thank you so much for joining me for this episode. Let everybody know a bit about yourself, your personal connection to the Caribbean, and of course, what inspired your work and passion for Caribbean Sign Languages.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. I'm so honored to be on Strictly Facts. Hi, everyone. As Alexandria said, I'm Kristi Ali. I am a PhD candidate in linguistics at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. I was born there, I grew up there, and I lived there until I moved for my PhD 2 years ago. So, what inspired me is a long story, but I'll try to make it as brief as possible. So I got into linguistics in my undergrad, which I'd never heard of linguistics before. Previously, I was obsessed with learning languages and speaking languages. But I had never realized that there was a whole field of science where you researched how languages were used and how they worked. And you asked questions about language, and then you went and did research and found out the answers too. And that blew my mind. And I said I want to do that for the rest of my life. And luckily for me, I went to the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, for my bachelor's and my MPhil. And luckily for me, there were three levels of linguistics courses on sign languages, specifically on sign languages used in the Caribbean, taught by Professor Ben Braithwaite at UE St. Augustine. Half of the class was on the linguistics of sign languages, particularly Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language as it was set in Trinidad. And the other half was where we were taught how to use Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language by an expert deaf teacher, Ian Danulal. So that was my first foray into sign languages. And through those classes, both Ben and Ian were super inviting to come to community events, come meet more deaf people. They were both very of the view that if you're learning a sign language, you should be embedded in the community. You should know deaf people. You should sign with deaf people. You should learn from deaf people. So I went to a lot of deaf events. And Ian is a very well-known leader in the community. He's an advocate for sign language rights for deaf people in Trinidad and Tobago. And so through Ian, I learned a lot about what the community wanted and what it was trying to do. It wanted legal recognition for Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language to improve primarily the education of deaf kids and deaf adults. So there's a lot of issues that I could go into, but I'll keep it brief, that would be improved by recognizing that Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language was a real language and that it was the primary language of deaf people in Trinidad, and the kids deserved access to it. So Ian had a lot of experience with that, and he shared so many ideas with me. And so this was my first experience with community-based research and activism as well, as opposed to like academic-led research. And I understood the balance of both and how academia is not the experts and how academia is actually always trying to catch up with community members. So I was really, really lucky that Ben, my professor, was really encouraging to like follow what deaf people want and say. So because of that, I really got roped into the community. And so I think what really helps is having personal connections and making friends. I suddenly became good friends with Ian and other deaf people, and that was it. I was just continuing doing that. I did a lot of volunteering, and I eventually ended up working for a deaf-led organization called Deaf Empowerment and Advancement Foundation, DEAF. I worked for another nonprofit that wasn't deaf-led but served the deaf population. I went on trips with both Ian and Ben to different parts of the Caribbean to meet other deaf communities, to do the same thing that we were doing in Trinidad there, to like get to know what they wanted, what their situation was, how well documented and resourced were their sign languages, how many protections and rights do they have. Because for both of them, their passion wasn't just lay in Trinidad. They wanted to do a pan-regional project in sharing resources across countries, making connections across communities, and yeah, just working together to achieve more. So that's the brief of it. It's been 7 years since that started, so a lot have happened. But yeah, that's how I started my passion for sign language linguistics.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm always intrigued and just, really moved by how we get our starts. I think especially when we get into grad school, it feels like, we're here and we're doing this thing and we're just trying to get to graduation. And I always love that reminder of my why and other people's why as we're, moving through regularly, right? But I definitely want to kick us off. You touched a bit on, the need for documentation and other aspects of Caribbean Sign Languages as you were speaking. And, when I think of oftentimes, whether that's English in the region, but, that also applies to several other languages, we think of the ways that they came to the region, through colonization and, which ones really get uplifted versus which ones don't. Could you speak to a little bit of, in general, how Caribbean Sign Languages really got their start, whether that's, through missionaries coming in, and maybe if that's not the case, but, what really sparked their growth within the region? Because obviously, deaf communities are across the world.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a good question. And I do agree, knowing the history really helps to know where we're headed.
Hmm.
So I'll start off by saying that you may have heard of American Sign Language. So people usually think of American Sign Language when they hear sign language. And a misconception people have is that there's one sign language. I hear this a lot. How come there isn't a universal sign language? And wouldn't that be useful to have a universal sign language? And I always try to tell people, what about the diversity of spoken languages? The same way that spoken languages vary, are diverse, there's 7,000 spoken languages at the moment, so too the sign languages are diverse. So, in terms of the origins of sign languages, to an extent, they do mirror the origins of spoken languages. So, you can imagine some spoken languages do descend from parent spoken languages. So, like French descending from Latin, for example. American Sign Language is a good example of that. American Sign Language descended from French Sign Language, and that's true of other European languages. In the Caribbean and in the global South is a bit different because deaf education doesn't play as much of a role in the origins of sign languages. So there's lots of rural areas where the communities don't use the sign language in formal education. They use it outside of formal education. It emerged naturally in a community where there's multiple generations of a family, where there's multiple deaf people in different generations, and the language emerged out of like a need to communicate with one or a few deaf people, and then it was passed down to further generations and nativized. So it was acquired natively by young people. So you could say it emerged organically. So that's one way sign languages can emerge. So without any influence of other sign languages. But in the Caribbean, and in Africa and Asia, American Sign Language does play a huge role in the emergence of new sign languages through missionaries, as you identified, but also through the setting up of schools and the introduction of American Sign Language into the schools as the right or proper way of signing. So Missionaries, you're right, they have been in the region for many, many decades and they'll continue to be there. Canadian and US missionaries who bring ASL and try to, well, convert deaf people. And it's quite powerful because oftentimes deaf people are isolated in families who don't want to sign with them. But these churches present like an opportunity for social communication and having a social network because they're usually hearing people in those churches because they really want to convert you who sign very fluently. So churches can be a huge factor for deaf people to make friends, to have a network. And then in deaf education, there were missionaries and proponents of ASL coming to the region, particularly around the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and introducing ASL to those teachers in the schools who were all hearing, by the way, so they don't know what the best way is, right, for deaf people to learn. They just know that, hey, this comes from the global north. It seems great. And so ASL was introduced as a method that you can communicate with deaf kids. And so that in the 60s, 70s, and 80s presented a major shift for a lot of deaf communities in the Caribbean, particularly Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Grenada, a bunch of other, like Cuba, lots of other Caribbean territories. So if there was a sign language before, it was now being dominated by ASL. And in some cases, the formal sign language has persevered. So in Trinidad and Tobago, there's still Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language, which was what they were using before ASL was introduced. But of course, with ASL being introduced into the schools and schools being a major transmitter of language, the newer generation started using ASL. And then with the introduction of globalization and media, it's so dominant in media. That's the main sign language that people see. So I like to say ASL is like the English of sign languages because it's not the most widely used sign language natively, but everyone knows some of it. Everyone's aware of it. Everyone knows how prestigious it is. So in some cases, I would say it's really endangered. A lot of the native sign languages. Yeah, so in total, American Sign Language, importation of American Sign Language, but also there was some sign languages before that grew organically, some of which are very endangered. Um, in the French Caribbean, French Sign Language is also used, and in the Dutch Caribbean, I know the sign language of the Netherlands is also used. So it also depends on the colonial powers of those places as well. But I think ASL is just permeated everywhere.
In preparing for this episode, I was reading about the Cascade School for the Deaf
Yes.
in Trinidad, right? So for those who may not be familiar, it's the first school of the deaf in Trinidad, got started around the 40s. But what I found really interesting about that story was, they're teaching students, the formalized ASL versions, right? But the students, when they went back to the dorms, were, in effect, I'm not sure if it was called Trinidad Sign Language yet, but they were maintaining their own versions of sign language different from what was being taught in the classroom. But again, to your point, right, these things get waned out over generations, and if they're not passed down, etc. You made a really interesting point, comparing like the ASL to English. How do you see various Caribbean sign languages differing from those of, the major like colonial influences? So, for Trinidad or for Jamaica, it would be Jamaican Sign Language to ASL, but it could be, Dutch Sign Language and Curaçaoan Sign Language. How are those similar? How are they different?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I really like that you brought up Cascade School for the Deaf because I do think those kids, when the teachers weren't looking, sign in their own way. That's what we now know to be Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language. And I find that such a beautiful act of resilience. And that's not just about those deaf kids. I think that Caribbean people in general are very resilient about the use of language, that we have kept our ways of speaking despite hundreds of years of brutal colonialism. So I just want to say that's also something that really moves me. But yeah, I when I say that ASL is like the English of sign languages, people are like, oh yeah, ASL is like English, sign language is like English. I'm like, no, 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 I didn't mean that. I don't mean it's the same as English. Because that's another misconception is that it's just English on the hand, right? It has English grammar, and that's not true. So they're very, very different from each other. And sign languages vary differ from each other as well. So as you mentioned, Jamaica, so there is a national sign language called Jamaican Sign Language. And even though it's called Jamaican Sign Language, there's variation within that. So Jamaica is very big, has lots of different deaf schools. It's just massive, right? So there's different, I mean, in different parishes, people probably sign differently and all sorts of things. There's also a country sign in Jamaica that emerged in Top Hill, kind of a more rural area that didn't have any influence from ASL or Jamaican Sign Language, and those people have been really resilient in keeping country sign as well. So just within one territory, you can have multiple sign languages or multiple varieties. So there's so many misconceptions. Not one universal sign language, not like English or other spoken languages, and there's not one sign language per country as well. I think the one sign language per country is such a European colonial mentality because Europe is very much like one language, one nation, right? Which the US has adopted. And so people have this idea of one nation has to have one language. We know what it's like in the US. But that's not really true. Multilingualism is the norm in the world before it was crushed by colonization. And that's just true of sign languages and true of spoken languages too. So in terms of differences, I would say the national sign languages may tend to be similar because they tend to be the ones influenced by ASL, but they're still quite different. So a Trinidadian and a Jamaican who know Trinidadian Tobago Sign Language and Jamaican Sign Language will be able to communicate, right? So there's probably ASL vocabulary in common, but a lot of the grammar is going to be so different. Just the Jamaicanness and the Trinidadianness will be so different. But those like national sign languages are the ones that I mean, they tend to be the national ones because they are influenced by ASL as well. And the smaller, less recognized sign languages like country sign tend to be more marginalized and stigmatized even. So people who grew up using country sign, maybe when they move to the town or the city and meet other deaf people who use Jamaican Sign Language, may stop using country sign because it's more prestigious to use Jamaican Sign Language. It's more proper. So even within our territories, we have these hierarchies of what is better, right? Because it's approximating American Sign Language. So that's another issue of, are we endangering smaller sign languages in territories by having this idealistic idea of one nation, one sign language? And so when there is language policy being written, hopefully, this is my dream, is that there's language policies written in the Caribbean for every territory that includes all of our native languages, including sign languages. I hope that we don't forget that there are different smaller sign languages. And even if they're small, like in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, there are people in the Grenadines who use a different way of signing. But it doesn't matter if it's small. It's so important to protect people's native languages because that's the way to get information. If there's another hurricane or if there's another natural disaster, what language are they going to be receiving information in? You can't assume that they're going to just use the national sign language and that's access for all. So it has huge consequences.
I think that's really an interesting point when we're talking about, the fact that in general, maybe somebody signing from in Trinidad Sign Language could communicate generally with somebody signing in Jamaican Sign Language, for instance. But those regional differences are really interesting to me. One side of my family is from St. Elizabeth, and so the Jamaican Country Sign
Mm.
Language is, a big part of what's used primarily out there in, rural parts of the island, like St. Elizabeth. I'll include this in the transcript for you all so all of our listeners could see it, but could you offer us an example of, maybe how a country sign language or a sign language of a more rural place would differ from the national sign language?
Yeah, so I can give you an example of Trinidad. There's the national sign language. So let's take the word mother. So in Trinidad and Tobago sign language, which is now what they call the national sign language, you can sign mother like this, which is actually the same as mother in ASL, which is where it comes from. But the older, more smaller variety of Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language, the one that emerged before the introduction of ASL, you would sign mother like that. And that has its own story because the folklore is that the mother is signed like that in Old Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language because it looks like a mother spanking a child's butt or something. And it's like, and this is what is great about our own sign languages as well, that they have like incredible stories, whereas the ASL versions really are like, well, this is what it looks like. We don't really know why, and it seems more proper and smoothie. But yeah, I'll definitely send you those examples to put in the transcript.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much. I look forward to it. Um, One thing that I think is great about your research, as you were noting a little bit earlier, is that you've really traveled far and wide studying various Caribbean sign languages and, how they differ, how they're similar, and even beyond what, we've been talking about as sort of the national sign languages, if they are referred to as that. One place that you have done research in, though, is the Bay Islands and studying Bay Island Sign Language, which I think is not only, integral for our conversation in general on sign language, but, you know, there are so many times where there are parts of that I consider, parts of the Caribbean that, aren't traditionally considered parts of the Caribbean, right? And so, for those who may not know, the Bay Islands are off the coast of Honduras. But, through migrations, through movements, and all of these things, especially, there is a distinction between like mainland parts of South America and Central America and how they fall into, more Caribbean cultures just based off where they fall in the world. Could you talk to us a bit about Bay Island Sign Language and even your experiences as a interpreter as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I love what you said about the Bay Islands because I agree it's one of those places that aren't deemed to be Caribbean. But from my experience being there, they have such a Caribbean identity that when I say I'm from Trinidad, it's like, oh my God, you're from Trinidad. Like we learned about Trinidad in school. And I'm like, oh, we didn't learn about you. And I felt so bad, because they really were like, we're the same, we're from the Caribbean. And it's so incredible. That is one of the best experiences of my life, is really working in the Bay Islands because it really transformed how I see the Caribbean, how I see myself as a Caribbean person, and identify as a Caribbeanist, and that's really transformed that definition of Caribbeanist as well. So, I mean, they're descendants of enslaved Africans in the Bay Islands, and they're former colonizers as well. There's the Garifuna people. There's Latinx people from mainland, but just a beautiful, diverse place, and it's in the Caribbean Sea. It's not politically, run by Honduras, but there's still this really strong sense of a Caribbean identity. And my work there was also working with a community. I did research there with Ben and Ian as well. We made an initial trip in 2016 because Ben knew people there. He knew there was deaf people there. They wanted to talk to us. So we went, we met a lot of people. We made some initial recordings. We were like, yeah, they have their own sign language. But what I didn't realize was that there were generations of deaf people, but a lot of them were blind as well. And through talking to people, we discovered that people were born deaf and then became blind later on in life. So they gradually started losing their vision until they became completely blind. And that happened across generations. And so it seemed like it's a genetic syndrome that causes that. But what was so interesting was that they would touch each other's hands to sign. They'd touch each other's hands on bodies, sometimes even face, to sign on them. And so, unlike visual sign languages, where just people just sign in front of their own bodies, they were touching each other's bodies, and the other person was like perceiving the language through the touch, and that was even which is even more incredible. People thought that this was really normal, right? So when people didn't think there was anything weird about, well, you touch an older deaf person's body or hands to sign to them. And there were lots of people who told us when they were growing up, it was just normal to do that. They never thought anything about it. So I think some people never even thought about it not being normal. But it's actually extremely rare to have a community with so many deaf blind people and to have a tactile sign language is what is called being used there. So that was really incredibly just fascinating. And this community was super interested in their family history, their oral history, community history. And so they really wanted to document that. More so than the language itself, because the youngest deaf person was over 50. And so, um, really, if there's no children acquiring a language, no deaf children at least acquiring a sign language, then it is unlikely to be passed on, right? So they're hearing people who sign, but they're not going to use it primarily unless there's a deaf person. So what they were more interested in was documenting their history. And so in 2018, we got a grant from the Endangered Languages Documentation Project to document this language. And the three of us lived there for 3 months, going to people's houses every day, talking to them, recording videos. They would tell stories about their past. We record conversations between two or three people. We would do interviews. We'd go around the island and they'd tell us things about, I don't know, their past and stuff. And we have 50 hours of video recordings of the sign language and have a wealth of oral history. And so apart from just being a really incredible sign language, a tactile sign language, it just is a really important part of Caribbean history, I feel like. Just because the Bay Islands are left out, at least in our part of the Caribbean, as being part of the Caribbean, but also their history tells a lot about the history of the Bay Islands. A lot of their stories go back 100 years because it had been passed down generation to generation. And so I was learning about the history of the Bay Islands while I was learning the language, right? And so just one of the ways that being a linguist has really improved my entire life by really, really opening my mind to the possibilities of what it means to be Caribbean.
You made a point that I think is really beautiful, just like, we go in thinking we're studying one thing, right? You're there and we're going to document the language, but language tells so much of our history through that too, right? And just even, you know, holding to the fact that you can learn so much about a people, about the history, about colonization even, right, from some of these various ways that we communicate. So, thank you so much for sharing that, and, sharing a bit about your experience in the Bay Islands. I definitely have to ask this question, the go-to strictly facts question of every episode, but one that, I think is very apt at this moment where in my view, right, I don't think people were necessarily paying a lot of attention to sign language until it became, there are a lot of like translators and interpreters during performances and concerts and things, right? And now we have TikTok and all the apps, and,
Mhm.
an interpreter will go viral because not only are they signing, but they're like jamming while they're signing, right? So, what are some of your favorite examples of this history of Caribbean Sign Language showing up in our popular culture today?
That's such a good question. I think that, yeah, the interpreters are actually the most visual parts of sign language today, but they tend to be from the US still. So I think that Korean sign languages haven't really made it mainstream and like in world media, but social media is such an important platform for deaf people in the Caribbean. Like that's where everything happens. Um, and I mean, even there's some bad representation of sign language in the media where, do you know of all these cases where there's a fake interpreter who's signing? Yeah, I know that's sometimes
Wild.
that, yeah, sometimes that's what people's first thought is about sign language. They're
Mm.
like, do we have an interpreter? Like, I'm like, yes, I know it happens way too often. But if I were to think of the Caribbean, so I would think about my first thing that comes to mind is all of the amazing videos that have been created and posted on social media by deaf Caribbean people. There's stories, there's jokes. I think you kind of have to be in it to see it though. Like, it's a bit niche content. Just because like deaf culture is so different from the way hearing people use language and how we act. Like people love acting out things, love using language in like a really funny way. And there's a lot of videos that I will like scroll through Facebook or something and see someone I don't know, acting out maybe a story of when they were in school and the teacher did this, and they're like acting is really on point and they did a lot of editing and stuff like that. And I just think that people are so creative, well, infinitely creative in the Caribbean. And I don't know, deaf people are just it just feels really terrible that ableism really puts this light on people as being like deficient or less than, or like they can't be funny, or like they can't have their own culture or their own funny ways of using language. That's really unfortunate because I don't know. I invite everyone to get involved in their deaf community, local deaf community, respectfully, by learning how to sign the local sign language and being really respectful and getting to know deaf people on, a personal way, a personal level. You'll find that they have so much to say that will blow your mind. That will, revolutionize what it means to be a Caribbean person, what it means to be a person from your country. Because yeah, there's this super marginalized, historically marginalized community in your country that you even know of, with their own ways of speaking, their own culture. Yeah, that's my initial thought is the social media.
I agree. I think I've seen some amazing pictures by Jamaican sign language interpreter Tony Aiken.
Yeah.
And just to watch their work, I think is amazing. So I will definitely, find some of those clips and link them for our listeners, not only on the Strictly Facts website, on our Strictly Facts syllabus, but also in our transcript for this episode as well.
Yeah, something I forgot to mention, sorry, is that maybe Tony has done this before, but like interpreting Caribbean music, Caribbean songs into
Hmm.
Jamaican Sign Language or Trinidadian Sign Language. Like there's a lot of soca songs that have been interpreted into Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language. I'm sure it's the same for Jamaica. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's another favorite of mine.
We will link those for all y'all to check out. You brought us to, my final question though, as you were talking about the issues with ableism and, how people just are maybe not even conscious or aware of some of the systemic issues. What are your hopes, for increased equity for the deaf and hearing impaired communities in the region? And really, how can we increase access and understanding and, greater opportunities for them to be improved?
Yeah, it's a great question. Quite complicated. I'll go from my bias perspective first, is that I think that language is everything. I think that language rights are social justice rights. Um, if you can legally recognize people's native languages, they can thrive in education. They can have access to education in their own language, which would improve their education levels. They can have access to interpreters in medical settings and justice settings everywhere, and they can have better employment rates if they have access to interpreters in their languages. There'll be less, even it's like a gender thing, like there'll be less gender-based violence if women had access to services in their language, if queer and trans deaf people had access to services in their language. So I think that in order to do that, you have to one know that their language exists, that they're not just doing gestures, they're not just using English on their hands. You have to know that exists. You have to document their language, which a lot of deaf researchers are doing at the moment, and it's really amazing. Um, I think that knowing someone's language, knowing that it exists, is to know someone's humanity. So that's my biased answer. Other people come at it from different perspectives, but eventually I think we get to the same point.
And that they all should be recognized as part of our national
Yeah.
languages, right? In the same way that, for centuries, activists have, um, you know, advocated for us to not deem patois, or, Jamaica's national language as lesser than English, right? It is definitely in that same category. Not only should like a Jamaica sign language not be looked down upon compared to like ASL, but we should be holding it to the same regard because it is a way that a portion of our community, of our nation speaks. So, with that, Christy, I thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time and expertise in sharing with our Strictly Facts family about sign languages in the Caribbean. Um, as a little sneak peek, this isn't the only episode we'll be having. So I will leave that teaser for our listeners. We will be having a follow up conversation very soon. But other than that, again, Christy, thank you so much to our Strictly Facts listeners. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. I think I learned a lot, and I hope you did as well. So, till next time, Lickle more. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us at Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook, and at Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.